So scientists have amazing skills. They can unravel the mysteries of quantum entanglement or the intricacies of the human genome. But when a new PhD comes out of graduate school, the only interaction they've often had with a sponsor-type entity is their thesis advisor or maybe their thesis committee, okay? And so when they first engage this enigmatic government sponsor and they have to either report on their results or they have to put in a new proposal, they often fall back on a mode of behavior thousands of years old, in which they feel they have to make the best possible technical offering, a 50-page technical detailed report full of the passion of their research, or a publication on the altar of their sponsor, which might be a proposal submission process or a program review, in order to get continued gentle rain of funding on their scientific crops. Okay. This only works a small fraction of the time. We need to understand, scientists need to understand the sponsor better. They need to understand how to craft their communication skills. Now, dating services and managers use things like Myers-Briggs charts to understand the emergent behavior of people's personalities and how to figure out who matches up or what kind of interaction they really need to have in order to get the job done. Okay, but what we'd like to do is construct something like a Myers-Briggs personality chart for organizations. Now, I'm an astrophysicist by training, but during my career at the lab, I've been a program manager having to deal with many government organizations, and I've also been lent out to government organizations and become native, so to speak. Now, it seemed that every organization that I was involved with was unique and different, and you had to learn from scratch. But then one day, I had an epiphany. That epiphany was there was an emergent pattern, and it was a predictable pattern. And that pattern could be used to craft the kind of communication you need with different sponsors. But first, we need, in order to construct this tool, we need to understand what are the phases, what are the things that make up an organization, and what are the different parts of it. And in reality, organizations, for the most part, these sponsor organizations, are a balance of process and expertise. And nowhere is there a better example of the balance of process and expertise than here at Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project. In fact, out in front of Fuller Lodge, down the street here, there's a statue of Robert Oppenheimer and General Groves. This pair of statues embodies the balance of process and expertise. On the one hand, you have Robert Oppenheimer, who was the academic leader of the technical and innovative side of the project. On the other hand, you had General Groves, who led the logistics and resource management that made the Manhattan Project possible. This is a yin-yang relationship. Process enables action to solve the problem, but problem expertise defines and validates the process. Now, what happens if in an organization the balance shifts? Maybe it becomes process or expertise dominated. Well, if expertise dominates the organization, you might have something like Sheldon Cooper's gang in The Big Bang Theory. These guys always execute all sorts of wonderful ideas, but they run into problems with university processes. If the balance goes the other way, you have something like Major Kong's crew or in the movie Dr. Strangelove. His B-52 crew, if you've seen the movie, is very procedure and process oriented until they run into trouble and they literally have to do out-of-the-Bombay thinking. Okay, so how do we characterize the behavioral tendency of a sponsor or sponsor's organization? Are they process or expertise dominated? And how do we predict that? So I'm going to construct for you a chart. And the chart has 4 quadrants. And on the horizontal axis, we're going to have something called the sponsor subject knowledge quality, which is the average sponsor's time spent in a problem area over the time it takes to become an expert in that problem area. Okay? So if this is less than 1, the sponsor, or the average person in that sponsor's organization, is advice or procedure driven. If that ratio is greater than 1, we have a sponsor who's internally expertise driven. On the vertical axis, we have the sponsor persistence factor, which is the average time that a sponsor stays in the organization over one product cycle or project cycle for that organization. If that ratio is less than 1, that sponsor is a visitor to that organization. If that ratio is greater than 1, that sponsor that you're dealing with is an owner. They own the problem tip to tail. So now let's look at what happens, what a sponsor is like in each of these quadrants. Up in the top right, this is like that new PhD's thesis advisor. When he or she brings that technical product to them, they'll be on the same page. They'll have a great dialogue, and it'll be a productive time. So this is the 25% of the time, perhaps, that approach works. Let's look at history of some examples of something in that box. So let's look at NASA and the Saturn V moon rocket. Okay? In 1967, the Saturn V flew for the first time. It took 5 years from project start. There was no moon rocket to actually flying the moon rocket. This was an age when there was no PCs, no internet, and no PowerPoint. Okay? One person, Wernher von Braun, led one center, Marshall Space Flight Center, to develop this rocket. He was a subject matter expert. He was passionate. He worked with Walt Disney to popularize space travel. This was the 5th or 6th product cycle for him. Started with the V-2 rocket in Germany in World War II, and then when he's brought to this country, the Redstone and Jupiter-C rockets, finally culminating in the Saturn V. Let's look at the opposite diagonal. So this is an example of an expert-based organization led by an expert. Down here at the other quadrant, we have the process sponsor. Process and procedure dominates the behavior down here, and the subject matter expertise is a commodity to be acquired through process. A sponsor down here will be in place for a short period of time. Let's look at a history example of this. This is NASA and the space shuttle. From the Challenger report, we find that the space shuttle program was run by 4 NASA centers, and the management in each of the centers, there were 3 levels of management before you got to somebody with actual hands-on technical expertise. The first flight was in 1981, and it was 13 years from project start to the first flight of the space shuttle, and it never met any of the lofty goals at the beginning of the program. Let's look at the top left. We have an owner, advice procedure-driven sponsor who's basically a politician. Politics dominates the sponsor behavior. An example from history is the Office of Homeland Security, not the Department of Homeland Security, but the Office of Homeland Security that was stood up 11 days after September 11th. And who did they put in charge? Not somebody from the FBI or police departments or the CIA or FEMA, but Governor Tom Ridge. Okay? Down in this other quadrant, we have what I call the policy sponsor. This is an expert that comes into a sponsor organization, only spends a short period of time, much shorter than the product cycle. This person has a vision or pet issues or policy concerns that dominates his or her behavior. An example of history is right here at Los Alamos on the issue of nuclear testing. So when the moratorium went into effect in 1992, the complex still had to be prepared. If the president ever decided that we had to do another underground test, to do it. But basically, it's been over 20 years, and that product cycle has gone to infinity. So almost all of the managers that cycle in and out of this now fit down here. Now you can have transitional forms on this chart. And my favorite is DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, because DARPA recruits an expert from a field, but only hires them temporarily for exactly one project cycle to do some high-risk, high-payoff project. DARPA program managers share characteristics in both of these boxes. So now what happens if that new PhD delivers that purely technical offering in each of these boxes? Well, up here, as I already said, they'll grok together. They'll understand each other. It'll be a good interaction. At the bottom left, if you just dump a technical presentation to a process sponsor, they'll ignore it unless the appropriate financial, procedural, coordination, and information support and accompany the presentation. In the upper right, we have the politician sponsor who's going to ignore that 50-page report unless your project can be summarized in a 5-word soundbite that tells them how it's going to help their current crisis situation. The policy sponsor is going to ignore that 50-page report unless the technical schedule and objectives match the sponsor's short time scale to make a policy, issue, or vision impact. So my takeaway is research your sponsor, test this idea for yourself, and help validate this as an aid to communicate with your sponsor for your next report or proposal. I want to thank you all for your time.